In the fall of 2002, my wife and I arrived at Briarcrest College and Seminary ready to embark on a new journey. We were now married students, and we were invited to live in married housing on campus for the first year, along with 7 other married couples. And this was wonderful, and it was a wonderful time to connect with lots of different couples. Now, the married housing was part of a larger dormitory, and married housing was on the first floor, and above us were 2 floors of women's rooms, dormitory, and so it was quite a busy place. It was a very nice place. It was one of the newer buildings on the campus at Briarcrest in Saskatchewan. It was at one point a military base, and so some of those dorms dated back quite a long ways, and that's where my first dorm room was. So this was an upgrade, and I really appreciated the new place that we had. And so we moved in that year, and let me tell you, it was a great place, but it was very small. The living room, kitchen, and dining room were no smaller than this stage. And so that was where we spent our first year of marriage. I don't know what your first apartment was like when you were first married, but picture that and think about that. And as much as we enjoyed connecting with people, we couldn't wait to move out. It was a furnished apartment, so we didn't own anything. We showed up with a car full of wedding gifts and nothing else. Now, fast forward 22 years later, and when I think about maybe going back to that apartment, well, it seems ridiculous, doesn't it? One, we have far too much stuff. I mean, we have a house full of stuff. And even if we sold it or put it in storage, we probably wouldn't fit in that 1-bedroom apartment. And then we have some kids as well. And so to think of a family of 5 moving back to a 1-room apartment, well, we wouldn't fit. Like, it would just be beds and nothing else. And so thinking back to those days, while that 1-bedroom apartment was perfect for our first year of marriage, 22 years later and 3 kids later and a lot of stuff later, we wouldn't fit. It just wouldn't seem practical. It would be ridiculous, really, to go back. Would it be ridiculous for you, even if you were in that stage of downsizing, retiring and downsizing? There are things that you look for now that you didn't look for when you were looking for your first apartment, like an elevator. When you retire and you downsize, first on the list, does it have an elevator? Or does it have any stairs? Those are a no, right? As we get older, it needs to have an elevator. It needs to have probably more space than a 1-bedroom apartment. It needs to have space for all of our stuff. Well, we enter our last Sunday into the book of Hebrews. Next Sunday is December 1st. Believe it or not, that's the beginning of Advent. And so we switch and shift focus next Sunday. But today we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 10. And Hebrews is a great book. It's a very interesting, and we've said it's a challenging book, and yet in some ways it's quite simple. Basically, the author of Hebrews says you can't go back. You can't go back to the way things used to be. You can only go forward. And that pertains to most of our life as well as it pertains to our faith. We cannot go backwards. So we finished this morning in our series on Hebrews, and the author has hammered the point home to us. By the time we get to chapter 10, Jesus is far superior than every way from the old ways and traditions of Judaism. Going back to the old ways of doing things is a ridiculous idea. The author is basically saying, going back to offering sacrifices and having a high priest intercede for you and doing daily offerings for forgiveness of sins is no way to go. It's like having a family of 5 moving into a 1-bedroom apartment with all of their stuff. It doesn't work. It's a ridiculous idea. And the author of Hebrews says there's no way that once that you have believed in Jesus, that you believe that he has forgiven your sins, put your faith in him, trusted him in everything, to go back to the old system. There's no way to go back. And repeatedly, the author of Hebrews uses the Israelites as the example of what not to do or who not to be. See, the Israelites were desperate. They were wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, and God was taking care of them. He was feeding them and giving them water, and every time they complained, he did something amazing, and they complained more. And they just said, we want to go back to being slaves. Picture that. We would rather go back to making bricks for Pharaoh without straw than trusting God who has looked after us in the middle of nowhere for years. And the author of Hebrews says, don't be like them. You can't be like them. All they needed to do, the Israelites, were to trust God that he would lead them to the promised land. And at the cusp of that moment, when they were ready to cross the Jordan River into the promised land, they did not trust him. And they ended up wandering the desert for years and years. So we begin, or look at our chapter this morning, chapter 10. We'll look at 19 through 25. Let me read our passages this morning. And it begins with an important word. Now, I'm not an English major, but I know this word is important. Therefore. So we're looking back, or he's summarizing all of the other 9 chapters previously in these verses. Let's read verses 19. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened to us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on to love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. As I've mentioned already, the new believers, those that had turned from Judaism to believe in Jesus, wanted to go back to their old faith and practice. It's all through the book of Hebrews, and as much as the Jews wanted to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, there were some that didn't, and there were others that did, but couldn't quite wrap their heads around what this meant for them. I don't know if you like to look back through history, but sometimes it's great to sit down and just kind of think through the life that you have lived. And often when we reflect on history, we wear rose-colored glasses to reflect on those days, those good old days. And when we think back and tell stories and reminisce about the good old days, well, we often spin them in a much more positive light than what they actually were. Do you notice that? When you think about the good old days or how things used to be, or if we could just go back to that time, often we think they were much better than our current situation. And maybe they were in some ways. Certainly that one-bedroom apartment was nice in 2002, but it wouldn't do us much good in 2024. It just wouldn't fit. And as much as we would like to turn back the clock on all kinds of parts of our life, maybe it's politics or business or church, and we think about how things used to be, how good they used to be, we can't go back. That's the whole premise of Hebrews. There is no going back, there is only going forward. Part of our desire to go back is because it was comfortable. We were in control, or at least seemed like we were in control, or we could be in control because we knew everything there is to know. It's part of our history. It's part of our DNA. If we went back to 2000 or 2010 or before that, 1995, I was graduating from high school in 1995. What a great time. The world was my oyster. I could pick and choose wherever I wanted to go, whatever I wanted to do. But I can't go back there. There were challenges, for sure, in 1995. I don't remember those challenges. I just remember how good it was, how great it was, graduating from high school and thinking I could go do anything I wanted to go do. But there were challenges that were going on in my life and in the world that I've forgotten all about. And we paint the past with rose-colored glasses. And I think about the Jews or the Israelites thinking about going back to slavery. I think they were looking back with rose-colored glasses because nobody in their right mind would want to go back to slavery. Nobody in their right mind would want to go back to a ritual, traditional system of blood sacrifices. You think about that. Just the amount of resources you would need as a family to offer sacrifices daily at the altar. Pigs and goats and doves and on and on and on. And think about the smell. I mean, if you had to come here daily or weekly or yearly to offer a sacrifice to God, I'm out. No, thank you. That doesn't sound exciting at all. That's not the kind of ministry that I want to be involved in. But this is where the Jews were headed. They wanted to go back to the temple. See, when Hebrews was written, the temple was still standing. So there were still Jews sacrificing and doing those things as part of Judaism. And then there were other Jews that believed in Jesus and wanted to follow Jesus that walked away from the temple and all of its sacrifices. And it was a challenge to walk away. And then in 70 AD, just a few years later after Hebrews is written, the temple was destroyed. And sacrifice, that tradition ceased to exist any longer. But think about that. They must have worn rose-colored glasses to think about how good it used to be. And Hebrews is saying, no, in every way, Jesus is superior. In every way. Jesus' blood had become the curtain that was torn between the holy place and the most holy place. And his once and for all sacrifice paid the price for our sin. Previous, present, future sin. Complete, total. There can be no going back. There can be no going back to asking the high priest to enter the Holy of the Holies once a year to pay for our sin. It is not good enough. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was complete and final. And part of the challenge with that is that we're out of a job. See, the Jewish system was all about how good you were as a person. And if you were good enough, then you got to go to heaven. And almost every religion in the world is based on that system. If I am a good enough person, if I do all the right things, say all the right things, go to church, then I get to go to heaven. And Jesus comes along and says, no, nothing you do or say or practice is good enough. The only thing that is good enough is me and my death in your place. And so when we go to church or when we do things, we do them because we want to, because God, because of Jesus, has changed and transformed our life. Not to do good works. Not to think that if I do this or say this or don't do this or don't say that, it will get me to heaven. It won't. Nothing we do will be good enough. Nothing that the Jews did was good enough either. It was a shadow of things to come. And I'm not saying the shadow of things were to come, 2024. No, what is to come? Eternity. This is a shadow of what is to come. Eternity in heaven. There's no going back. There's no going back to the way things used to be. There's no going back to offering sacrifices. There's no going back to slavery. Hebrews says the only way to go is forward. Because Jesus has paid the price once and for all and fully for us. And Jesus' sacrifice for us runs much deeper than any other sacrifice could have. All the way to our core, Hebrews says, to our very conscience, to our very heart, to the very depth of who we are. That's how completely Jesus' sacrifice has paid the price for us. And going back would be ridiculous. I don't know if you remember or heard the story of the Great Fire in London in 1666. But there is about a third of the city of London was burnt in that fire, including St. Paul's Cathedral. And if you've ever seen pictures of St. Paul's Cathedral, it's amazing. It's beautiful. Well, St. Paul's Cathedral was built way before that and had gone over many restorations before that time, but in 1666, the fire destroyed the cathedral completely. And so there was a massive effort to rebuild this once great cathedral. Christopher Wren was the chief architect for the job. Now, Christopher was not an architect, but he was hired. And there was a lot of controversy over him being hired. He was an engineering genius. And so he was hired to take this project on. And he ran into roadblocks, and people didn't like his design for the building. And 35 years later, the cathedral was rebuilt, bigger and better than ever, just exactly how he had designed his first drawings. The dome that sits on top St. Paul's Cathedral is 65,000 tons. And it's a massive building. It's beautiful. It has grace and elegance to it. It's an amazing place to go and worship. And when Christopher talks about his inspiration for the building, he turned to Hebrews chapter 10, the passage that we're looking at this morning. And he said that was part of my inspiration for the design and the architecture and the massive way that this amazing church cathedral was built. But he said that it's just a glimpse of what is to come. It's a shadow of a future hope, of eternity, of what eternity must look like. Now, we don't have cathedrals like that in Canada, at least not in Western Canada, and this certainly isn't that. But this is a shadow of what's to come. And as much as we would maybe like to go back, if you remember where we began, First Baptist Church, Penticton, began with 13 founding members in someone's living room. And then they built a church at White and Main Street, which is under construction right now. But White and Main Street had a one-room schoolhouse. And quickly they outgrew that church building. And they had a Sunday school room that had a dirt floor in it. And I think about that when Bill was saying the kids could go off to kids' church. Imagine sending your kid to a room that had a dirt floor in it. You'd be like, I'm out. Yeah, no, thank you. But that was where we began. And it was a different time and a simpler time, and it might have been a great time. I have no idea. But we can't go back there. And this is only a glimpse of the future. A place that we can gather and worship. The temple was a glimpse of the future. St. Paul's Cathedral was a glimpse of the future. This is not the end. And the one that has the end in control is not us. It's Jesus. And I realize that the world has changed drastically in the last 120 years. And the world has changed drastically in the last 5. And will change drastically in the next 5 to 10 to 20 years. And if there is a message that the Hebrews author wanted to get through to us and to all that have read the book of Hebrews, is that Jesus is far superior in every way than we can possibly imagine. And then he says, but. It's always a great parent thing to say, but don't stop meeting together. Now here, the author, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have YouTube or all the other channels where you could watch all those great pastors preach wonderful sermons all the time. Or podcasts where you can listen to every great leader around the world talk about all the things that a church should be doing. Or whatever else there is to listen to on a podcast or on YouTube. Yesterday on YouTube, I learned how to take the front bumper off of a Toyota Yaris and replace the light bulbs in the headlights. That's how it's done. Just saying. And in 10 minutes, it was successful. I had wrestled for an hour beforehand to figure out how to take these bulbs out and replace them. In my Toyota Sienna, it's a 5-minute job. In and out, piece of cake. In a Toyota Yaris, it's remove the front bumper, take the light fixtures out completely, and then change the light bulbs. Thank you, YouTube. But the author of Hebrews says, but don't stop meeting together. Even though Jesus is far superior in every way and has paid the price ultimately for everything and forgiven your sins, don't stop meeting together. Now, we read that with our Western eyes and we say, yeah, okay, don't stop going to church on Sunday morning. No, that's not really what he said. Because the temple was the place for everything. Yes, they went there to worship and to make sacrifices. They also had community meals there. They did business there. It was the center of life. Education happened there. Everything happened at the temple. And though you don't need to go to the temple anymore, he says, keep going. Keep meeting together. Keep being together as you figure out how to live this new life with Jesus as your high priest. Keep meeting together to encourage one another. What was also happening in this time is that the Christians were being persecuted, and they were fleeing Jerusalem because of the persecution. And he says, no matter what, whatever the circumstances are, don't stop meeting together. Don't stop studying the scriptures. Don't stop praying together. Don't stop eating together. Don't stop worshiping together. Don't stop. Now, growing up on the farm, I often felt like we were isolated from most of the world. We were 10 miles out of town, which back then was a long ways. It's not any longer. But my dad would go to town almost every morning, going to town for coffee. Why do you have to go to town for coffee? There's coffee right there. Going to meet the guys for coffee. What do you talk about with the guys for coffee? I never understood it as a young person. We have work to do, Dad. Like, the sun is up, there's work to do. I'll be back, he says. And it doesn't matter how busy we were or what was going on, he often would go to town, have his cups of coffee, shoot the breeze with the guys, learn whatever he needed to learn that was going on in the world, and then come home and go to work. And I thought about that, and I think about that as I get older, and I think, guys, yeah, it was great to have breakfast yesterday. We need to get together more often. We need to have that open invitation to just drop in and have coffee. Do you have that with somebody? Where you could just be like, just walk in. We don't do that, do we? It's not very Canadian of us. I don't know. But on the farm, that happened all the time. People just dropped in, pulled up to your house, and walked in the front door. Here for dinner. Okay, I'll put another plate down. Here for an evening drink. Okay. And it still happens. To this day, people just pull up, walk in the front door, sit down for a couple hours, talk about whatever's going on in their life, in the world, faith, politics, you name it. I don't have anybody showing up at my door just coming in. I don't know if you do, but I always say that my door, and I know Bill's door is always open. My door at the church, even my door at the house, well, I might put you to work, is always open. And what a world, what a difference maybe that would be if we had those times where we intentionally just were together. Because it's far too easy to not be together, isn't it? And even when we're together these days, we're not. Let's face it, I have teenagers in my house, and even though we're sitting in the same room or even at the same kitchen table, we're not together. We're all like this. Or we're somewhere else, we're thinking about something else. I mean, it's very hard to have a conversation. We've lost that. We've lost the art of being together, of sitting in silence maybe, or asking hard questions. If you can't talk about faith and politics and, I don't know, what else is there to talk about? If we can't talk about the hard things, then we talk about nothing. The author of Hebrews says, don't stop. Even though Jesus has done everything for you, paid the price, made the sacrifice, he is your high priest who intercedes for you. You don't need to go and ask the priest for prayer or forgiveness. You can do that on your own. And then he says, but don't stop meeting together. Don't stop being together. Don't stop encouraging one another, supporting one another. Some of my best ideas come out of times when we're sitting together talking about nothing important. And you get this idea of, oh, yes, that's a great idea. And somebody says, what? That's not what I meant. That's okay. It's a great idea. Well, let's go do that. Some of the best ministries of the church throughout history happened because people got together and said, hey, we should do that. We should start a hospital. We should start a ministry. We should do whatever. Fast forward hundreds of years and you have the church involved in every aspect of the world doing great ministry because people got together and said, hey, what about this? And even though Jesus has done everything for us, we need each other to follow Jesus together as we move forward in this new world. And wherever it's going, well, that's God's plan. Our plan is to be faithful and to meet together as his people.